This screencast is going to talk about the characteristics of life and what makes something living. You can find this in Chapter 1, Section 3 of your textbook. The first thing we have to understand is that we are in biology class, and we need to make sure that we understand what biology is. Biology is the study of living things and the study of the interactions of those living things. So a lot of times you think of the interactions of living things as ecology. But there are many other ways that organisms interact besides just eating one another. The word biology itself, the prefix of bio, stands for life, and ology is the study of. So that's where we get the study of life. First, I apologize for this word loading in the middle of it. I could not get rid of it. So our first characteristic of life is that living things are made up of cells. That is a key idea of anything that is living. Cells are the basic unit of all living things, and living things can be unicellular, which means that they are made up of just one cell, or like you and I, they may be multicellular, which means that they are made up of many cells. Living things must also be able to reproduce. Reproducing allows the next generation to pass on traits that are either favorable or not favorable for the environment, and that kind of leads into evolution. So reproduction, we'll start to understand, plays a very important role in the process of evolution that we will get to second semester. But in order to be alive, you must be able to reproduce, and you could reproduce in different ways. Either it could be asexual, in which there's only one parent, and basically this would also be called cloning. Nature has naturally always cloned itself. So this right here, this little bud coming off of this organism here is called a hydra, and that little bud right there is a clone of the parent, and it will actually break off right in this little section right here, float off into the water, and establish itself in a new place to live. There's also sexual reproduction, which means that there needs to be two parents. Typically we have an egg and a sperm coming together so that we get a combination in the genetics of the two parents. Again, I apologize for this word loading right in the middle. Third characteristic of living things is that all living things are based on a genetic code. And so you inherited your traits on your DNA, and you got those traits from your parents. You got half of your DNA from mom and half of your DNA from dad. Now that doesn't mean that you are exactly half mom and half dad. When we get into genetics, we'll start to understand that some traits are expressed and some traits are not expressed. So even though you got half of your DNA from mom and half of your DNA from dad, you might still look a lot like mom, or you might still look a lot like dad. We'll start to understand that more in our genetics unit. All living things must also grow and develop. You are not the same size as you were when you were born, and you are constantly changing. So you're changing your size and your shape, you're developing and maturing over time. Living things have a lifespan in which this occurs within. Living things also use and need energy, so there's a few vocabulary words that you should note on this page. Some organisms will produce their own food. This is called an autotroph, and this process can be done by one of two processes. One is one you probably are familiar with, photosynthesis, and the other is chemosynthesis. So some organisms will use the sun's energy, that would be photosynthesis, to make food, and other organisms will use chemicals. This oftentimes happens in organisms at the bottom of the ocean. Now, you and I are heterotrophs, which means that we must consume food. We are also called consumers. There are also what are called decomposers, and those are going to break down dead material for their food. So fungus is a good example of a decomposer. Bacteria is another example of a decomposer. So autotrophs, photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, heterotrophs, consumers, decomposers are going to break down that dead material. In order to be living, you also respond to surroundings. So you have to react to something that's a stimulus. Any action that you have causes a reaction. So in this image over here, you touch a hot stove and you pull your hand back. That is you responding to the surroundings. Even plants, a plant will be growing by a window, and if the plant is over here and the sun is shining on that plant will start to bend towards the light, and so your flower might start to kind of grow like this, and it is responding to the environment in order to get that sunlight. Living things also must maintain a stable internal environment. This is actually called homeostasis. A good way to think of this is your body temperature. You must maintain a body temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. If you don't, you start running a fever or you might have hypothermia. And so your body responds to that by either sweating or shivering, depending on if you're hot or cold. Dogs, they don't sweat, so instead they pant in order to bring their body temperature down. And so that's our body responding and trying to maintain a stable internal environment. We'll actually spend a whole unit at the very end of the year on homeostasis, understanding how this works in your body and in other organisms. Living things also evolve. This is going to be connected to the other characteristic of living things, which is that living things are all made up of DNA. Over a long period of time, organisms are going to adapt, and that means there's going to be changes in the DNA because of changes in the environment. Organisms change over time, and entire species change over time. And again, we will have a whole unit on this during the second semester as well. So the following slides, there's some images. Think to yourself whether these are living or non-living. This is a fire here, and you can say that a fire will reproduce. However, a fire is not made up of cells, so it's not going to be living. So think about the following pictures, decide if it's living or non-living. Fire is non-living. Here we have a picture of a baby. You should say living. Here's a picture of a rock. You should say non-living. A rock is not made up of cells. It is only made up of atoms. It also does not contain DNA. Here you have a penguin with its baby. You should say living. Here we have some markers. Markers are not made of cells, so you should say non-living. They also do not contain DNA. This is a Megalodon. They are now extinct. You should say that it was living. Of course, they are extinct now. Here we have a fossilized jaw. It is non-living, but it was once a living thing. If it is fossilized and made of rock, it's non-living. You should say living for this one. This is called a lichen. It is actually similar to plants. It forms on rocks and breaks down the rocks, so this is a living organism. This is a mushroom. Mushrooms are decomposers. They are living. This is some coral at the bottom of the ocean. Coral is made of cells. They do have DNA. This is a living organism. This is a sand dollar. This one is washed up on the shore, but it is a living organism. Oftentimes sand dollars are sold as souvenirs along the beach line, but they were a live organism. This is a sea star. It is also living. This is what bacterial cells look like under the microscope. Bacteria are also living. They are actually the simplest living organisms on our planet. You might not recognize this picture. This is a virus. Viruses invade your body and make you sick. However, viruses are not considered living. First, viruses are not made of cells. They are made up of an outer protein coat. They do have DNA inside of this protein coat, and that is actually what gets injected into your body and makes you sick. They do reproduce, however, they cannot reproduce on their own. They must inject the DNA into your cells in order to reproduce. So they can't do it on their own. So there are several arguments that makes a virus not living.